I recently wrote an article for the Global Echo called There Is No Post-Racial America, which prompted me to want to talk about the language of discussing race and, by extension, racism. Now, it's hard to express complicated societal ideas in words, which is why words like race and ethnicity often get confused. There are whole academic fields dedicated to this, but you don't need a whole degree just to get a grasp of the language, which is what I'm hoping to do with you today. The first point that I'd make is that colour does not equal ethnicity, does not equal race. There are different schools of thought on this, but generally race is used as an overarching physical term. You are genetically your race, whereas ethnicity is more complicated because it brings race together with nationality, culture, and also self-identity and self-determination. You are born a certain race, but you grow into your ethnicity. Colour is, in many ways, the simplest and easiest to understand, but I'm going to get back to why that's important later on. To demonstrate how these things might break down, white is a colour, white is arguably a race, but white is not an ethnicity. Side note for anyone who wonders why I use white instead of Caucasian, the word Caucasian comes from Enlightenment era pseudoscientists who basically invented the idea of scientific racial purity, so no. And that neatly brings us to racism. The common definition of racism is discrimination, hatred, or prejudice based on race. However, there is a trend in academia and in activism to make a distinction between racism and racial bigotry. Racism here describes a wider system of disadvantage based on race, whereas racial bigotry are the personal prejudices of an individual. By definition, we already know that reverse racism cannot exist, because the reverse of something which is racist is simply something that is not racist. But to go further with that, if we accept racism as that system of disadvantage, then regardless of whether or not those disadvantaged people have their own prejudices, those prejudices would not affect or mitigate their position of disadvantage. Racism that comes from those in a position of power inherently has more effect than the bigotries of people who already have no power. Also, not all ethnic prejudices are based specifically on race or colour. This makes the term xenophobia very helpful because it describes a fear or hatred of otherness, whether or not colour is a factor. To take an example from my own context in Ireland, the ethnic group which faces probably the most legal and social discrimination are travellers who are also white. This does not, however, change the fact that globally the paler your skin, the greater your societal advantage. The world has been globalized into ethnocentric European standards of beauty that have people all over the world believing that they need to look more white to succeed in life. Newsflash, if you think that African natural hair is unprofessional, you are racist. If you think that only pale Asians are attractive, you are racist. A term often used here is colorism, which describes the differing treatment people of colour receive depending on how their features fit into what is traditionally considered white. And also, as an Irish person, can you please stop using my country's history of being colonised as a prop to silence activists of colour? Really, stop. Ireland's history should have taught us empathy with people facing oppression today, but the sad truth is it frequently doesn't. Irish Americans in particular need to stop using this card, because guess what? You dropped the ball. You missed your chance to use your history to make a positive change in your country, and now every time you invoke the memory of Irish people who were killed and oppressed and enslaved under British colonialism in order to diminish your responsibility for the racism of today, you do that memory a massive disservice and a massive disrespect. I'll be the first to say that I'm not an expert, unless someone has already left that in a comment before getting to this point in the video, in which case I am the second. But you can't study my major in Jewish and Islamic history and culture without studying how culture and ethnicity and race interact. And I did a whole module on human rights law where these definitions become even more important because you can't write a law about something you can't define. With human rights, and I think any kind of activism, you have to be constantly challenging and reevaluating your definitions, because you're trying to navigate this path between post-colonial ethnocentrism and lazy neoliberal moral relativism. And for more on that particular intellectual headache, you can see the description, where Future Me has hopefully left a list of helpful links and resources. I am not an expert. I still have a lot of learning to do in this area, and I encourage you all to do the same.